What's up, everybody? Brady for Yale here, coming at you with a review of the new Designing Creation album Origin that was released this past Friday, February 14th. These guys are a relatively new band. They formed in, I believe, 2020, according to their Spotify, and this is already their third album. They're also a relatively small band. I honestly don't remember how I discovered them. Somewhere on social media led me to them, and I was very intrigued to listen to this album based on the sound of the singles that were released. In particular, both Recluse and Crosshairs of a Gunsight very much scratched that nostalgic mid-2000s metalcore itch, which this entire album ends up doing. But just from that sound alone, like I said, I was very intrigued to check this album out and give it a review. The best way I could describe the album, but in particular those two singles, because I've obviously spent a lot more time with those singles, it's sort of like if that new As I Lay Dying album a few months ago was better and had a unclean vocal performance that was a bit less monotone and there's the overall absence of clean vocals entirely. Like, Crosshairs of a Gunsight, even in the full album context, is still one of my favorite songs on this album. It, much like every song on here, abuses the 5/7/8 riffs, but it's contrasted pretty well with the breakdown parts, and there's an excellent guitar solo near the end of the song. And what I maybe like most about the song is that it uses those similar sounding riffs, the 5/7/8 riffs, notorious 5/7/8 riffs being staples of the 2000s metalcore sound. They use those same riffs and same melodies, but they do it in multiple different feels. Whether it's like those pivot riffs, which is the typical route to go with the style of metalcore, or it's the tremolo riffs, or it's those breakdowns with the tremolo riffs kind of adding that extra layer of ambiance and atmosphere over them. Production-wise, everything sounds amazing. That snare drum really pops, the bass drums sound really muscular, and it really supports those more percussive and chunky rhythm guitars, driving more of those breakdown-type riffs. Recluse is pretty cool, too. It uses, obviously, very similar styles of riffing, which will become a criticism I have, but with the singles and for the majority of the album, it doesn't become too much of an issue. But with this song, yeah, it does a good job of balancing it out a little bit better than some of the other songs on here do. There's also a really cool like rhythm guitar chord progression that comes in at like the 247 mark that ends up leading into another pretty cool solo. These are two songs that very clearly take prominent influence from As I Lay Dying, Parkway Drive, early August Burns Red, before they went more progressive. In a sense that it's essentially kind of just at the gates riffs with breakdowns and more percussive guitars layered in and spliced in, which, as a massive 2000s metalcore fan, that appeals to me. As far as the non-singles go, I think the opening track, Bear Hunter, is a very strong track on here, whether it's that acoustic guitar intro that leads into one of the more like methodical, chuggy type riffs on here. I thought that was a cool transition. There's also that like ambient break that happens just under halfway through the song that leads into this crushing breakdown with these really mean and visceral death growls. I thought that was a really powerful collision. And there's some cool chord progressions to end this song. I especially love how they kind of weave in and out of those 5/7/8 riffs and incorporate more like, I don't know if I want to say like deathcore-esque, like Bring Me the Horizon, Count Your Blessings-esque kind of guitar patterns there, kind of spliced in with the 5/7/8 riffs, as I mentioned. Butcher of Men keeps the momentum going for this album, although it is in similar styles as I've discussed so far. It's track 2 on here. It doesn't really get stale at all, and there's a really cool part vocally on this song where the vocalist kind of like fluctuates between this really high, shrieky, almost black metal type vocal right into like a full-on like pig squeal, essentially. Drastic vocal jumps like that are not easy to do, and this guy makes it sound so easy and so effortless and so fluid. I was really taken aback by that vocal part. Skip to 2 minutes and 13 seconds into the song exactly to pinpoint it. Track Mindcage is a cool departure from the overall like bright, positive mood of this album, just in the guitar riffs, with some really dark melodies. I especially love that chord progression in the bridge that actually is the rhythm guitar chord progression underneath the solo. And in the beginning of the song, you get more of those percussive guitar riffs, but rather than just abusing the 5/7/8 riffs further, they actually throw in like some moody, like atmospheric, dissonant type notes. And it's weaved in very cleverly to where it really does like contrast the heaviness with that eerie atmosphere. I thought that was pretty cool too. Overall, this song just has a much more like dark and moody vibe to it, which was a much needed departure, especially at this point on the album. Another track that kind of does that is the track Dirty 30s. It is another one of the more like urgent tracks on here with a lot more momentum towards it. The opening chord progression in particular kind of disassociates from the overall mood of the album and the established riffing style so far, especially considering it's the final track on here. I thought that was a wise move from the band. And there's also this sort of like modern In Flames style acoustic guitar outro that I thought was pretty cool. The tracks Feeble Minded and Jonesin, which, side note, some of the titles on here are so like random. I want to know like who thought of these titles really. But those two songs use like the familiar riffing style, but incorporate more extreme metal elements alongside it, which does make it a little bit more refreshing and break up some of the monotonous ideas that I'm about to talk about. So yeah, as I've hinted out throughout this review at multiple points, the album being so similar stylistically and using very, very similar riffing styles, being clearly inspired prominently by 2000s metalcore bands like the acts I mentioned earlier, all of those elements combined do make this a very monolithic and singular album as far as the scope of ideas going on. There are no tracks on this album that are outright bad, and I think I could listen to any of these tracks on their own and enjoy them. But when you're like me, and you, especially doing these reviews, listen to these albums all the way through, and I'm just like that in general, even aside from reviews. I'm an album guy. I like listening to albums sequenced in the track listing that they were given to us with. When you are like that, this album really, really blends together. And even aside from the individual tracks blending together on here, when you listen to this album like in sequence all the way through, like I feel like I'm burnt out of the 5/7/8 riffs, and I never thought I would say that. But I'm serious, like this album absolutely beats you to death with the riffing style on here. Like even just 4 tracks in, like I really enjoyed Recluse as a single, but when I saw that it was 4th in the track list and I was getting through track 3, Proctor's Ledge, like I was like, oh great, here comes this song. Literally the only real break we get from this style of riffing after track 1 is the track Mindcage, which I singled out earlier, and maybe that's why I liked it so much, because it broke up the monotony of this album. And listen, I get it. This band is clearly inspired by those acts I mentioned earlier. I would be shocked if they said that they weren't. But the unfortunate consequence of that is that the album suffers because it really blends together and it is a very singular scope of ideas. And these songs, which a lot of them are really killer songs, especially like the singles and the songs that I have kind of listened to on its own, or I put them on my gym playlist and it plays in the middle of a bunch of other songs and I get hyped from it because it's not surrounded by a bunch of songs that are so similar to it. These killer songs just don't shine as much as they could have if they were on a more diverse album. After listening to this record the full way through multiple times throughout the last few days, I think the worst, like, I don't even know if I should say worst, but the most skippable tracks on here because of those reasons for me are Proctor's Ledge and Doomcloud. And even the track Recluse, which I just said at the beginning of the video I enjoyed as a single. But these 3 tracks in the full album context easily stick out to me as the tracks that contribute the least amount of new ideas on this album. So I mean, as great as this style of riffing is, and as this style of metalcore is, like, it gets stale when I listen all the way through. And believe me, I love this style of metalcore. I mean, some of my favorite metal albums, period, are from this style of metalcore. Killswitch Engage is my favorite metal band. I mean, Alive or Just Breathing, obviously End of Heartache, As Daylight Dies 2, and from other bands, fucking Trivium Ascendancy, As I Lay Dying, Frail Worlds Collapse, And Shadows of Security, All That Remains, Fall of Ideals, This Darkened Heart. Those are literally some of my favorite metal albums, but all of those albums had different ideas going on alongside this style of riffing. Or even like some of these newer bands, like the Dying Wish album, Symptoms of Survival, that I did a favorite albums video on. That Boundaries album that I reviewed last year that made my top 10. There's lots of ways to make this style of metalcore still creative and still having a wide scope of ideas and not feeling singular and monolithic. So as much as I enjoy all of these tracks individually, the scope of creativity on here is just so limited that it really impacts the overall listen of the album as a full body of work, and as a result, pretty significantly impacts the score I'm going to give the album, which is going to be a 15 out of 30, which is just the fairest way I can score it, because the tracks individually on here are great, but when the album is this much of a chore to get through as a full body of work, and I might be biased because when I listen to albums for these reviews, I really, really listen and study them over the course of multiple days, so I might just be really burnt out from it. But it's for that reason that I may not return to it, at least for a long time. Regardless, though, shout out to this band. I mean, they obviously are super talented. Some of the guitar solos on this album are great. The vocals on here are phenomenal. And if you are a fan of this style of metalcore and any of the bands that I've compared them to throughout this review, I highly recommend checking them out. Even if you feel the same way as I do that this album as a full body of work is a difficult one to get through, pick apart some of the songs and add them to your playlist. I've been doing that. I've been adding them to my workout playlist and listening to them at the gym. And they get the job done. Anyways, as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Check the description of the video for my Instagram, Spotify, and Threads links. Leave a comment below if you have checked this album out. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Remember to hit the subscribe button for more rock, metal related content, album reviews, bunch of other shit. And once again, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.